She was assaulted by the man who said he loved her, and it almost broke her inside. Her millionaire brother, cold and silent, swore revenge with his eyes and love with his heart. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Coming up, in the metropolis of New York City, between glass and concrete skyscrapers that cut through the gray sky, Richard Morris built an empire that mirrored his soul, cold, imposing, and impenetrable. At 42, he owned the largest luxury hotel chain in the country, a man whose presence commanded silence in any boardroom. His dark eyes carried the weight of a childhood marked by abandonment, his mother who disappeared when he was only 15, leaving behind just a tear-stained letter and empty promises of return. His father, Andrew Morris, transformed his son's pain into fuel for ambition. "Men don't cry, Richard. Men build," he repeated while forging the perfect heir to continue the family legacy. Each hotel acquired, each deal closed, each million accumulated was merely a desperate attempt to fill the void that departure had left. Richard learned to love numbers, contracts, and profits because they were predictable, controllable. People, on the other hand, always left. The only exception was Isabella Morris, his half-sister, 11 years younger. Daughter of a tango dancer his father met in Miami during a business trip, Isabella arrived at the Morris mansion when she was just 7, after her mother died in a traffic accident. Richard, then 18, saw in that girl with honey-colored eyes and curly hair something he never imagined feeling again, the instinct to protect. Isabella grew up being everything Richard was not. Where he was calculating, she was impulsive. Where he built walls, she opened windows. She graduated in psychology from NYU, worked at a non-profit in downtown Manhattan, believed she could save the world with hugs and the right words. Richard observed from afar, always present at graduations, always sending flowers on birthdays, always making sure she lacked nothing, but maintaining the emotional distance he had learned to cultivate as a survival mechanism. On sleepless nights, walking through the empty corridors of the mansion in Upper East Side, Richard sometimes stopped in front of Isabella's portrait on the library shelf. She was smiling in that photo, wearing the blue dress he had bought for her graduation. There was something in that smile that reminded him of his mother, but also something unique, a light he couldn't name, and that left him restless in a way he preferred not to analyze. The phone rang at 2 in the morning on a rainy Thursday. Richard answered on the first ring, as he always did for hotel emergencies. But it wasn't about business. It was Isabella's choked voice whispering his name as if it were the last word she could pronounce. "Richard, I need you." He didn't ask questions. He put on the first suit he found, ignored the driver, and drove personally through the sleeping city, the wet streets reflecting the lamplight like tears on asphalt. He found Isabella standing in front of her building in Greenwich Village, wearing dark glasses despite the late hour, arms crossed over her chest as if trying to protect herself from something invisible. When she got into the car, the silence was deafening. Richard knew that kind of silence. It was the same his mother maintained in the last days before leaving. Isabella trembled, even with the heater on, and avoided looking directly at him. Her delicate hands were clenched into fists, and there was something in her posture that made Richard's heart race in a way that had nothing to do with business or with anything he knew how to control. "Where is he?" Richard asked, his voice hoarser than intended. He didn't need to explain who he was. For the past 2 years, Isabella had been involved with Dominic Parker, an artist who frequented the art galleries in Greenwich Village, known for his provocative works and a bohemian charm that Richard had always distrusted. There was something in Dominic's gaze that deeply bothered him, a hunger that wasn't just for art or recognition. Isabella didn't answer. She just pointed to the mansion, indicating she wanted to go home. During the entire journey, she kept her dark glasses on, her face turned to the window as if the city outside could offer answers that Richard couldn't give. He drove in silence, but his eyes constantly strayed to her, noting each irregular breath, each defensive movement, each sign that something had broken irreparably. When they reached the mansion, Isabella got out of the car, as if each step were a painful achievement. Richard followed her to the living room, where the fireplace was unlit and only the city lights entered through the panoramic windows. It was then that he did what he never imagined he would do. He extended his hand and, with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed, removed the dark glasses from Isabella's face. What he saw made him recoil, as if he'd been punched in the stomach. The dark purple spread around Isabella's left eye like ink spilled on a white canvas. The delicate skin was swollen, marked by the brutality of fists that should have caressed, not hurt. Richard felt something shatter inside his chest, a primitive fury that came from a place he didn't even know existed. It was as if the past returned in a cruel gust, the helplessness of a boy who couldn't protect. His mother now replicated before the pain of the only person who could still touch him. My God, Isabella. His voice came out broken, unrecognizable. Richard instinctively raised his hand to touch the injury, but stopped mid-air, as if it would profane something sacred. Who did this to you? She looked away, tears finally flowing uncontrollably. It doesn't matter. I provoked it. I always provoke. The words came out like confessions of guilt, carrying a pain that went far beyond the physical. I don't know why I always choose the wrong men. I don't know why I always end up hurt. Stop. The word came out as a command, but soft as a prayer. Richard knelt before her, forcing her to look into his eyes. Never say that again. You didn't provoke anything. You don't deserve this. His voice was hoarse with contained emotion. He will never touch you again. I promise. Isabella sobbed, her whole body shaking with the force of the cry that had been dammed up for days. I don't want you to do anything, Richard. I don't want a scandal. I don't want him to suffer. I just want to understand why I let this happen to me again. The last word escaped like a secret that shouldn't have been revealed. Again, Richard felt his blood freeze. Again? But Isabella was already closing up again, hugging her own knees like a frightened child. Forget it. I just need a place to stay for a few days, just until I decide what to do. Richard stood up, his mind already formulating plans he wouldn't share with her. You'll stay here in your room for as long as you need. He paused, fighting the urge to go out immediately to find Dominic Parker and resolve this the way men like his father resolved problems. I'll have a warm bath prepared and call Dr. Sanders to examine that injury. No need for a doctor, Richard. It's just a bruise. It's non-negotiable. His voice returned to the authoritative tone he used in business. But there was something deeper there, a concern he couldn't hide. And I'll put security on the property. He won't get near you. Isabella looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Why do you always take care of me, even when I'm an idiot? The question caught him off guard. Richard was silent for a long moment, observing that injured face that could still be the most beautiful he had ever seen. Because you're the only good thing left of my family, he finally said, his voice almost a whisper. But as he accompanied her to the room, helping her up the stairs as if she were made of crystal, Richard knew it wasn't the whole truth. There was something else, something he had been denying for years, a feeling that grew in the shadows of his thoughts, and that now, faced with her vulnerability, became impossible to ignore. Chapter 2. 2 hours later, when Isabella was finally sleeping, sedated by the medicines the doctor had prescribed, Richard was in his office on the phone with the best private investigator in New York. I want to know everything about Dominic Parker. Where he was born, how he grew up, who his parents are, criminal history, previous relationships, debts, vices, everything. His voice was pure ice. And I want his access to this property blocked. If he shows up here, I want to be called immediately. But while giving the orders, part of his mind was stuck in that moment when he removed Isabella's glasses. It wasn't just anger at the violence she had suffered. It was something more disturbing, more confusing. It was the way his heart had raced when she said, "I need you," as if those words were the only ones he had been waiting to hear his entire life. Richard poured himself a whiskey and walked to the window overlooking the mansion gardens. New York glittered below, a constellation of urban dreams and nightmares. He thought of his mother, how she used to stand at this same window on sleepless nights, looking far away, as if waiting for something that would never come. He thought, of his father, who turned the house into a mausoleum of silences and obligations. And he thought of Isabella, sleeping in the room next door, trusting him to protect her from a world that seemed determined to hurt her. What he didn't know was that at that exact moment, Dominic Parker was a few miles away in his studio in Greenwich Village, making a call that would change everything. "I did it," he was saying to someone on the other end of the line. "She's exactly where we wanted. Now we just wait for him to take the next step." Richard drank the whiskey in one gulp, feeling the liquid burn his throat like a promise of war. He had no idea that the battle he was about to wage was not just for Isabella, but for the very soul of both of them. The next 3 days dragged on like a silent agony. Richard cancelled all meetings, ignored urgent calls from the hotels, and began living by Isabella's schedule. When she woke up, when she took her medicine, when she managed to eat a few spoonfuls of the soup the cook prepared especially for her. The bruise was yellowing at the edges, but it still hurt, and she avoided mirrors as if her own image were an accusation. On the second night, Richard was awakened by screams coming from the room next door. He ran barefoot down the marble corridor, his heart beating erratically, and found Isabella sitting in bed, cold sweating, her wide eyes fixed on something only she could see. "She was here," she murmured, her voice trembling. "The woman in white. She was here and said I shouldn't have come back." "Who, Isabella? Who was here?" Richard sat on the edge of the bed, carefully turning on the bedside lamp so as not to frighten her more. "I don't know. She had blonde hair, light eyes. She wore a wedding dress stained with dirt." Isabella rubbed her face with her hands, trying to get rid of the images. "She talked about you when you were younger. Said you cried, hidden in the bathroom after she left." "Why would I dream about that, Richard? I wasn't even here when your mother left." Richard's blood froze. His mother wore a white dress the day she disappeared. He had found the torn and dirty piece in her closet weeks later, as if it had been dragged through the dirt. He had never told anyone about this, not even Isabella. "It must be the trauma," he said, more to himself than to her. "Nightmares are normal after what you've been through." But when Isabella finally went back to sleep, Richard went down to his office and called the investigator. "Marcus, I need you to investigate my mother, too, Helen Morris. She disappeared in 1999. I want to know if there's any connection between her and the Parker family, or any link to this Dominic." The answer came the next day, in a sealed envelope. That Marcus delivered personally. Richard read the first pages sitting in the leather armchair in his office, but as he progressed, he needed to stand up, walk around, process what he was discovering. Dominic Parker wasn't just a failed artist with violent tendencies. He secretly worked for August Thompson, an old partner of Richard's father, who had been expelled from the company years ago after attempting a financial coup. Even more disturbing, Dominic had grown up in an orphanage in Lake Placid, and there were records that an elegant blonde woman visited him regularly in the years 2000 and 2001. The descriptions matched Helen Morris perfectly. If this were true, it meant that his mother had found Dominic after disappearing, perhaps even raised him as a son. Richard sat heavily in the armchair, his hands trembling slightly as he held the documents. If Dominic was somehow linked to his mother, it would explain how he knew intimate details about the Morris family. It would explain how he had approached Isabella with such precision, how he knew exactly where to hurt her to cause maximum emotional damage. "Are you okay?" Isabella's voice pulled him from his dark thoughts. She was standing in the office doorway, wearing a blue silk robe that highlighted the honey color of her eyes. The bruise had diminished, but it was still visible, a constant reminder of the violence she had suffered. "I am. You should be resting." Richard quickly put the papers in the drawer, but not before she noticed his state of agitation. "I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see that woman." Isabella approached slowly, as if testing if she was welcome. "Can I stay here with you? We don't need to talk. I just don't want to be alone." Richard nodded, unable to deny anything she asked. For Isabella settled into the armchair opposite his, pulling her legs up as she did when she was a child, and came to the office on nights she couldn't sleep. Except now she was no longer a child, and the way the silk robe slipped over her thighs made Richard need to constantly look away. "Do you remember your mother?" she asked suddenly, her voice low in the dimness of the office. "Some fragments. The perfume she wore, the way she played piano, the way she looked out the window on rainy nights, as if waiting for someone." Richard poured himself another whiskey, offering one to her, which she declined with a gesture. "Why do you ask?" "Because in my dreams she seems very real, as if I knew her." Isabella bit her lower lip, a habit she had since she was little when she was nervous. "And there's another strange thing. Since I came back here, I've been having confusing thoughts." "What kind of thoughts?" Isabella hesitated, her cheeks blushing slightly. "I dream about you too. Not as a brother. I dream of you touching me in a way that—" She stopped abruptly, realizing what she was saying. "Sorry, it must be the medication." The silence that followed was charged with an electric tension that neither knew how to handle. Richard felt his heart beating so hard he was sure she could hear it. He had fantasized about that moment so many times over the years, but always pushed those thoughts to the depths of his mind, labeling them as wrong, forbidden. Isabella. He began but couldn't continue. How to say that her dreams echoed his, how to confess that for years he had fought against feelings he knew were impossible. She stood up abruptly, as if she realized she had crossed a dangerous line. "Good night. Richard, thank you for taking care of me." But before reaching the door, she stopped and turned around. "There's something you're not telling me about Dominic, isn't there?" Richard looked at her for a long moment, weighing how much of the truth he should share. "There's always something we don't tell each other, Isabella. The question is whether we're ready for the consequences of knowing everything." She nodded slowly, as if understanding that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Chapter 3. The next morning brought news that made Richard question everything he believed he knew about his own history. Marcus had found something at the Lake Placid orphanage, old records showing that Dominic Parker wasn't just any orphan. According to the documentation, he had been left there by a woman claiming to be his aunt, who never appeared again. And there was a photograph. Richard studied the black and white image, his hands imperceptibly trembling. It was his mother, Helen, but with dark hair and simple clothes, unrecognizable to anyone who didn't know her intimately. She was holding the hand of a boy of about 5, Dominic. The date on the back of the photo was September 1999, 2 months after her disappearance. This means that— Richard couldn't finish the sentence. If his mother had taken Dominic to the orphanage, if she had taken care of him for years, this created a connection that went far beyond what he had imagined. Dominic wasn't just a random aggressor. He was someone who knew intimate secrets of the Morris family, someone who had been raised by Helen as a substitute son. The sound of barefoot steps in the corridor made him quickly hide the documents. Isabella appeared at the office door, wearing a white cotton nightgown that reached the middle of her thighs, her curly hair loose over her shoulders. The bruise had almost disappeared, but there was something different in her eyes. A determination that wasn't there in previous days. "I need to go out today," she announced, entering the office as if it were her territory. "I have things in the apartment I need to get, and I want to talk to some people." "No." The response was immediate, inflexible. "It's too dangerous. He might be waiting for that." Isabella crossed her arms, her chin raised in defiance. "I'm not your prisoner, Richard. I can't stay hidden here forever." "Yes, you can, for as long as necessary." Richard stood up, circling the desk to be closer to her. "You don't understand the gravity of the situation." "Then explain it to me." She took a step towards him, reducing the distance between them even more. "Stop treating me like a child and tell me what's really going on." For a moment, Richard considered telling everything about Dominic, about his mother, about the web of lies that seemed to surround the whole family. But part of him wanted to protect her from the truth, even knowing she had the right to know. "It's complicated," he finally said. "Everything in our family has always been complicated." Isabella was so close now that he could feel the heat emanating from her skin, the sweet jasmine perfume she wore. But that never stopped us from facing things together. The word together came out loaded with an intimacy that made Richard's heart race. He looked at her lips slightly parted, and for an insane moment considered doing what he had been desiring for years. Kiss her, feel the taste he imagined was honey and sin, discover if she would respond or flee horrified. The ringing of his cell phone cut the moment like a blade. Richard answered with a voice hoarser than he would have liked. "Hello?" "Richard." "Morris?" The voice on the other end was smooth, almost seductive, but there was something sinister beneath the courtesy. "I'm Dominic Parker. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Richard's blood froze. "How did you get this number?" "I have my methods and you have my girlfriend." Dominic chuckled softly, a sound that made Isabella pale as she recognized the voice. "I want to talk to her, now." "Don't even think about it." Richard held Isabella's arm when she made a motion to take the phone. "You lost any right to her the moment you assaulted her." "Assaulted?" Dominic made a theatrical pause. "What a strong word, Richard. Isabella and I had a discussion. Like any couple has. She's dramatic, always has been. I'm sure she exaggerated the details when she ran, crying to her protective brother. The fury that Richard felt was so intense that he needed to hold onto the desk to keep from screaming. "You hit her," I corrected her. "Just as someone should have corrected you when you were younger." Dominic's voice became colder, more threatening. But Helen was always too weak for that, wasn't she? Preferred to run away rather than face the responsibility of raising a real man. The world stopped. Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. "What did you say?" "Helen Morris, your mother." Dominic savored each word as if it were expensive wine. "A most beautiful woman, by the way. Too bad she had a taste for weak men. First your father, then, well, that's a conversation for another time." "You knew her. It wasn't a question." "Knew her? Man, she raised me for years. Taught me everything about the Morris family, about how to enter your lives. Isabella was just the most efficient means to get to where I want." Dominic made another pause, letting the poison of his words spread. "And now that I've succeeded, we can negotiate." Isabella snatched the phone from Richard's hand before he could prevent it. "What do you want, Dominic?" Her voice was firm, but Richard could see her hands trembling. "Ah, my love, how I've missed you." His voice became syrupy, manipulative. "I want you to come home. We have a lot to talk about, and bring your little brother along. I'm sure he'll be fascinated by the stories I have to tell." "Never." Isabella hung up and threw the phone on the sofa as if it burned. Richard hugged her instinctively, feeling her tremble against his chest. Her perfume enveloped him, the softness of her hair brushing his chin. For a moment he forgot the threats, the mysteries, everything that wasn't the sensation of having her in his arms, safe where she should always be. "He knows about your mother," Isabella whispered against his neck, her hot breath making him shiver. "He planned everything from the beginning." "I know." Richard tightened the embrace, breathing deeply her perfume. "But I won't let him get near you again. I promise." When Isabella raised her face to look at him, her lips were inches from his. Richard saw the reflection of his own need in her honey eyes, the same hunger that had consumed him for years. This time, neither of them pulled away. The kiss was as inevitable as gravity, impossible to resist like breathing itself. And when their lips finally touched, Richard knew he had crossed a line from which he could never return. Chapter 4. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to destroy years of carefully built self-control. Richard pulled away as if he had been burned, his eyes wide with horror and desire. Isabella remained motionless, her lips still parted, an expression of surprise and something deeper, recognition, stamped on her face. This shouldn't." Richard ran his hands through his hair, his heart beating so hard he felt the pulses in his temples. "I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me." "Don't apologize." Isabella's voice came out hoarser than normal. "I wanted it too." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with a truth that neither was prepared to face. Richard looked at her, really looked, and for the first time allowed himself to see not the girl who had grown up in his house, but the woman she had become. The soft curve of her shoulders, the way her lips seemed fuller after the kiss, the way she looked at him with an intensity that had nothing fraternal about it. "We can't," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "We're siblings." "Are we?" Isabella took a step toward him, and Richard backed up until he felt the office desk against his back. "Because if we really are siblings, why do I feel this?" She pressed her hand against her own chest, where her heart beat rapidly. "Why every time you look at me, I feel like I'm on fire." Richard closed his eyes, trying to block the image of her saying those words, trying to ignore the fact that each word echoed his own feelings. "Isabella, stop. You're confused because of the trauma, the medication." "No." She was right in front of him now, so close that he could count the golden freckles that dotted her nose. "This isn't confusion, this is real, and you feel it too, don't you?" Before Richard could answer, the office landline started ringing. They quickly moved apart, as if they had been caught in something forbidden. Richard answered with a tense voice. "Hello? Mr. Morris, this is security. There's a man at the gate who says he needs to speak with you urgently. Says he has information about your mother." Richard felt his blood chill. "Description?" "White male, about 40, dark hair, wearing a grey suit. Says his name is Dr. Martinez and that he worked with Mrs. Helen before she disappeared." Richard had never heard of a Dr. Martinez, but something in the description bothered him. "Don't let him in. Tell him I'll set up a meeting at a neutral location if he wants to talk." "I already said that, sir." He replied that Dominic Parker sends his regards and that Mrs. Isabella has only 24 hours to make a decision. Richard's blood completely froze. It was a trap, obviously, but what kind of information about his mother could Dominic have? And why was he using it as leverage? Send him away and double the security. Richard hung up and turned to Isabella, who had gone pale. "He's escalating the pressure." "What does he mean by 24 hours? Isabella dropped into the armchair, her legs trembling. "What decision does he think I need to make?" Before Richard could answer, his cell phone rang. This time it was a text message from an unknown number. The words appeared on the screen like a death sentence. "The truth about Helen is in a place you know well, Richard. The old country house in Lake Placid. Bring Isabella if you want answers. You have until tomorrow at noon. D." Richard showed the message to Isabella, seeing recognition spread across her face. The country house was where they spent summers, as children, where his mother used to play piano on hot afternoons, where Isabella learned to dance in empty halls. It was the last place where the family had truly been happy, before everything crumbled. "He wants us to go there," Isabella murmured. "Does? Why?" "Because it's territory controlled by him now, far from the city, isolated, perfect for—" Richard didn't finish the sentence, but both understood the implication. "I have to go." Isabella stood up, determination returning to her gaze. "If he has information about your mother, about what really happened, I need to know." "No," Richard was categorical. "It's obviously a trap." "What if it's not?" Isabella faced him with an intensity that made him falter. "What if your mother is still alive? What if she needs help? Could you live with the doubt for the rest of your life?" The question hit Richard like a well-aimed shot. He had spent more than 2 decades wondering what happened to Helen, creating increasingly dark theories, carrying the guilt of not having been able to prevent her from leaving. The possibility of finally having answers was like a drug he couldn't resist. "If we go," he said slowly, "it will be on my terms, with security, with a plan, with escape routes planned." Isabella nodded, but there was something in her eyes that worried him, a calm acceptance as if she already knew that this trip would change everything forever. "There's one more thing," she said softly. "In the last few days I've been remembering strange things, fragments of conversations I heard as a child, things that didn't make sense at the time." "What kind of things?" "I remember your father and my mother arguing about documents, about an inheritance that should be mine, but that was being hidden. And I remember once when your mother picked me up and said, One day you'll understand that sometimes true love comes from the most unexpected places." Isabella paused, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "At the time, I thought she was talking. About how you treated me like a sister, even though I wasn't of your blood, but now..." "Now what?" "Now I wonder if she was talking about something completely different." Isabella looked directly into his eyes. "I wonder if she knew that one day we two would fall in love, and was trying to tell me there was nothing wrong with that." The silence that followed was loaded with dangerous possibilities. Richard knew he should deny it, should say she was delusional, that the love he felt for her was purely fraternal, but the words refused to come out. Because deep down he was also beginning to suspect that nothing in his family was what it seemed to be. Chapter 5. The decision to go to Lake Placid was made in the early hours of the morning, when sleep had become impossible for both. Richard spent the night in his office, making calls to security companies, planning routes, organizing a small army of protection. Isabella, meanwhile, remained in her room, but he could hear her restless footsteps in the corridor, the creaking of the bedroom door when she opened it to peek if he was still awake. At 5 in the morning, she appeared at the office door carrying 2 cups of coffee. She had exchanged her nightgown for dark jeans and a white silk blouse, her hair tied in a ponytail that highlighted the delicacy of her neck. Richard felt his heart quicken again. Since the kiss, every gesture of hers seemed charged with a sensuality he could no longer ignore. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, offering him one of the cups. "No." Richard accepted the coffee, his fingers brushing hers at the moment of exchange. The contact was brief, but enough to make both shiver. "I was finalizing the preparations." Isabella sat on the edge of the desk, her legs swinging slightly. "What if we discover your mother is really alive? What if she chose to stay away from you all this time?" The question hurt more than Richard expected. "Then at least I'll know the truth." "Would you forgive her?" Richard considered the question for a long moment. "I don't know. Maybe. Depends on her reasons." He looked at Isabella, noting the way the morning light came through the window and created golden reflections in her hair. "And you? Could you forgive Dominic if you discovered he had reasons for what he did?" "No." The answer was immediate, firm. "No matter what his story is or what my mother, what Helen might have done, he hurt me. He planned this. He used me." Isabella paused, her eyes filling with tears she refused to shed. "But you know what hurts more? It's that for months I thought I was in love with him, that what I felt was real." "And it wasn't?" Isabella laughed bitterly. "How can it be real when it was based on lies?" She looked directly at Richard, and there was something new in her gaze, a maturity that wasn't there a week ago. "Now I know the difference between manufactured passion and this that I feel for you." The air between them became charged again. Richard stood up from the chair, approaching her until he stood between her legs. "Isabella, we can't..." "Why not?" She extended her hands, resting them on his chest, feeling the accelerated beats of his heart. "If we discover we're not really siblings, what would stop us? And if we discover we are, then we'll deal with that when the time comes." Isabella slid her hands to his face, forcing him to look into her eyes. "But until then, can I at least pretend this is possible?" Richard closed his eyes, fighting against every instinct that screamed for him to kiss her again, to pull her against him and forget all the complications. When he opened his eyes, he found Isabella studying every detail of his face, as if it were the last time she would see him. "We need to leave soon," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trip to Lake Placid takes 3 hours, and I want to arrive before noon." They left New York in a convoy, Richard's armored car followed by 2 security vehicles. During the first hour, they maintained a safe conversation about the weather, about the hotels, about any subject that didn't force them to face the tension simmering between them. But as they moved away from the city and entered the mountains, the silence became heavier. "Do you remember the last time we were at the country house?" asked Isabella when they passed the sign indicating the entrance to Lake Placid. "I remember." Richard drove with his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was years away. You were 15, it was summer, and you insisted on organizing a picnic in the garden. And you said it was too childish, but ended up helping to carry the basket. Isabella smiled at the memory. I remember that day you taught me to play chess under the cherry tree. And you beat me in the third game. Because you let me win. I didn't. Richard finally looked at her, a genuine smile touching his lips. You were always smarter than I gave you credit for. I was in love with you, Isabella suddenly said, the words coming out unfiltered. That summer I was completely in love. I spent hours imagining what it would be like if you kissed me, if you looked at me the way a man looks at a woman. Richard stepped on the brake involuntarily, stopping the car on the shoulder. The security cars behind them also stopped, and he waved through the window, indicating everything was fine. Isabella. I know I should be ashamed of this, but I can't. She unfastened her seatbelt and turned to face him completely. That was the summer I discovered what desire was, and it wasn't for the boy at school or the neighbor, it was for you. You were a child. I was a teenager discovering I wanted things I didn't understand. Isabella extended her hand, touching his face with a delicacy that made him tremble. And now I'm a woman who knows exactly what she wants. Richard captured her hand, intertwining their fingers. For a moment, he considered turning around, going back to New York, forgetting Dominic and all his threats, running away with Isabella to somewhere where no one knew them, where they could discover together if what they felt was real or just the product of years of proximity and recent trauma. But then his cell phone rang, bringing him back to reality. It was a message from Dominic. Can you see the house from there? Helen is waiting for you. Richard showed the message to Isabella, watching the color drain from her face. He's talking as if she's alive. Maybe she is. Richard started the car again, but this time he held Isabella's hand as he drove. Either way, we'll find out soon. As they approached the country house, memories became more vivid. The property appeared around the bend in the road like a ghost from the past. The white colonial house with blue windows. The gardens that once were well tended, but now seemed wild, the porch where his mother used to sit to read. And standing in front of the house as if waiting for them was a figure that made Richard's world stop completely. It was his mother, older, with grey hair, but unmistakably Helen Morris. She was alive, and next to her, with a cruel smile on his lips, stood Dominic Parker. Chapter 6. The world stopped. Richard felt as if all the years of pain, anger, and guilt crashed against his chest at once. The woman standing on the porch of the country house was undeniably his mother. Older, with wrinkles around eyes that once shone youthfully, hair that was golden and now showed silver strands, but still Helen. The mother he had mourned, searched for, and idealized for more than 2 decades. Isabella squeezed his hand so hard that her nails dug into his skin. Richard, is it her? He couldn't answer. His throat had completely closed up. During all these years, he had imagined this moment, what he would say, how he would react if he could forgive her. But now, faced with reality, his mind was completely blank. Helen descended the porch steps with hesitant steps, as if she too was fighting against conflicting emotions. She wore a simple navy blue dress and flat shoes, her hands intertwined in front of her body in a defensive gesture that Richard remembered well. It was what she did when she was nervous. "My son," she said when she was just a few meters away, her voice choked. "How you've grown." 23 years, Mother." The word came out as an accusation. 23 years since you decided I wasn't worth staying for." Helen flinched as if she had been slapped. "It wasn't like that. You don't understand. Then explain it to me." Richard got out of the car, Isabella right behind him. The security guards positioned themselves strategically, but kept their distance. "Explain how a mother simply abandons her son and disappears for more than 2 decades. Dominic approached, the cruel smile still glued to his face. "She didn't abandon you, Richard. She chose me." The phrase hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. What do you mean by that? Tell him, Helen. Dominic put his arm around the woman's waist in a possessive gesture that made Richard clench his fists. Tell him how you ran away with your lover and adopted me as a son. Tell him how we built a new life away from the golden prison that Andrew had created for you. Richard looked at his mother, searching for a denial in her eyes. But what he found was guilt, sadness, and a silent confirmation that destroyed him inside. You were having an affair. I was surviving, answered Helen, tears finally flowing. Your father. Andrew controlled me, Richard. Every movement, every word, every breath. He turned me into a porcelain doll to display at dinners and events. I was dying inside. And the solution was to abandon me? The solution was to find someone who truly loved me. Helen looked at Dominic with a tenderness that made Richard's stomach turn. Edward Parker was an art professor at the university. I met him at a lecture, and for the first time in years I felt alive again. Isabella stepped forward, her voice trembling. Edward Parker is Dominic's father? Was, corrected Dominic. He died in a car accident 6 months after Helen ran. Away with him. I was 5 and was in the back seat. His voice became colder, more bitter. Helen could have sent me to an orphanage, gotten rid of the son of the man she loved, but she raised me as if I were hers. Because I loved Edward, whispered Helen, and you were all that was left of him. Richard tried to process the information, but everything seemed too surreal. So you raised your lover's son while abandoning your own child? I couldn't take you, Richard, Helen's voice broke. Andrew had power, money, lawyers. He would never let you leave the country with me, and I couldn't continue in that house, in that life that was slowly killing me. You could have sent me a letter, a phone call, any sign that you were alive, and give Andrew a way to track me, to find us? Helen shook her head. You don't know your father like I do. He would have moved heaven and earth to bring me back, not out of love, but out of pride. And he would have destroyed anyone who stood in the way. Isabella moved to stand beside Richard, her presence being the only thing that prevented him from completely crumbling. And Isabella, what's her true story? It was Dominic who answered, his smile becoming crueler. Ah, that's the most interesting part of the story. He looked directly at Isabella. Do you want to know why you always felt different in that family? Why you never seemed to completely fit in? Dominic, stop, warned Helen, but there was something in her voice that sounded more like fear than authority. It's because you're not Andrew Morris's daughter, continued Dominic, ignoring the warning. Your mother, Carmen Luce, was Helen's friend. When she died in the accident in Miami, she left a letter revealing the truth. You are Edward Parker's daughter, my half-sister by blood. The world spun around Isabella. She held onto Richard's arm to keep from falling, her face completely pale. That can't be true. Andrew knew, continued Dominic, savoring each word as if it were expensive wine, but Carmen had a considerable inheritance that he wanted to control. So he forged the adoption documents, invented the story that she was his daughter, and raised you as a Morris to have access to the money. Richard felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. If Isabella was Edward Parker's daughter, it meant she had no blood relation to him. It meant that everything they had felt, all the guilt they had carried, was based on a lie. So he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. You're not siblings, confirmed Helen, tears now flowing freely. You never were. Andrew lied. To you your entire life. The relief Richard felt was instantaneous and overwhelming, but was soon replaced by an even greater fury. Why are you telling us this now? Why now? Dominic laughed, a cold and calculating sound. Because now that you know the truth, you can make an informed decision. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and extended it to Richard. Inside this envelope are documents that prove financial irregularities in your hotels, tax evasion, money laundering, bribing authorities. All with your signature, all dated from the last 5 years. Richard took the envelope with trembling hands. This is forged. Of course it is, but convincing a court of that would take years, and during that time your company would go bankrupt, your reputation would be destroyed, you would lose everything. Dominic approached, his eyes shining with malice. Unless you transfer 50% of the hotel chain shares to me, compensation for the years my adoptive family had to live in hiding because of Andrew Morris's paranoia. And if I refuse, then these documents will end up in the hands of the federal police tomorrow morning. And Isabella, Dominic looked at her with a hunger that made Richard see red. Isabella comes back with me. After all, now that we know we're blood siblings, I can treat her as she deserves. That was when Richard understood that everything had been a trap from the beginning. The relationship with Isabella, the violence, even this revelation, everything had been carefully orchestrated to arrive at this moment. And that was when he decided that Dominic Parker had made a fatal mistake by threatening the only person he truly loved. Chapter 7. The fury that took hold of Richard was different from anything he had ever felt. It wasn't the controlled anger of business or the calculated frustration of corporate disputes. It was something primitive, visceral, born from the depths of a man who had just discovered he could love without guilt, only to see that possibility being threatened by a manipulative psychopath. "You made a mistake," said Richard, his voice low but carrying a threat that made even Dominic back up slightly. "You made the mistake of thinking I would negotiate her life." "Richard, be sensible." Helen tried to intervene, but he cut her off with an icy look. "You lost the right to an opinion about my life the day you abandoned me," he said, each word cutting the air like a blade. "And you," he turned to Dominic, "will discover that my father's paranoia taught me some very useful things." Dominic laughed, but there was a note of nervousness in his voice. "Like what? You're going to kill me? Here? In front of your dear mother? In front of the woman you love?" "I don't need to kill you." Richard took a step toward Dominic, and even being physically smaller, there was something in his presence that made the other man back away. "I just need to destroy you, and fortunately, I have the resources for that." It was then that Isabella positioned herself between them, her hands extended to separate the two men. "Stop, both of you." Her voice was firm, determined, completely different from the fragile woman who had appeared at Richard's door a few days ago. "Dominic, you want the truth? Then I'll give you the truth." She turned to face the man she had discovered was her half-brother, her chin raised in defiance. "You're right about one thing. I always knew there was something wrong with my family story. I always felt I didn't completely fit in. But do you know what else I always knew?" Her voice became lower, more dangerous. "I always knew that Richard was the only person in this world I could completely trust." "Isabella," Dominic tried to interrupt, but she continued. "For years, I thought I was wrong for feeling attracted to him. For years, I carried the guilt of desiring someone I thought was my brother. And do you know how painful that is, knowing you love someone you can never have?" Tears began to stream down her face, but her voice remained firm. "But now I've discovered there's nothing wrong with me, that I can love Richard without guilt, without shame." Dominic tried to approach her, but Isabella backed away, seeking the protection of Richard's arms. "And you think I'll let that escape? You think I'll trade the man who protected me my entire life for the man who used me and hurt me?" She laughed bitterly. "You don't know me at all." "We're blood siblings," insisted Dominic, the charm mask finally falling to reveal the desperation beneath. "That means something." "It means less than nothing." Isabella nestled against Richard's chest, feeling his arms close around her in fierce protection. "Family isn't about blood. It's about choice. It's about who stays when everything falls apart. It's about who loves you even when you're broken." Helen observed the scene with tears in her eyes, and for the first time since they arrived, spoke without being asked. "She's right. I made many mistakes, Richard. The biggest was thinking that running away would solve anything. I left you to protect you from your father, but also to save myself. It was selfishness disguised as sacrifice." "Why are you telling me this now?" asked Richard, still holding Isabella against him. "Because looking at you two, I see what Edward and I could have been if we had had the courage to fight for our love instead of running away." Helen wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "You two love each other. Anyone can see that. And unlike me, you have the chance to be together." without destroying other people in the process. Dominic watched the scene unfold with an increasingly desperate expression. His big play had become a liberation for Richard and Isabella instead of a trap. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising an octave. "I planned this for years. Years I found Isabella, won her over, made her fall in love with me, all to get to you." "And in the process you fell in love with her," said Richard, his intuition connecting the dots. "That's why you're so desperate. It's not just about revenge or money. You really thought she would choose you." The expression on Dominic's face confirmed the suspicion. "She should choose. We're from the same lineage. We have the same blood running in our veins. She shouldn't be offering herself to the son of the man who destroyed our family." "Andrew didn't destroy your family," Richard replied, his voice calmer now that he understood the true motivation behind all the vengeance. "A car accident did. That. My father may be many bad things, but he didn't kill Edward Parker. But he forced us to live in hiding, forced us to change our name, to live in fear, to live a lie," finished Helen, her voice laden with guilt. "I did that, Dominic. I created this paranoia, fed this anger in you because it was easier than admitting I had made a selfish choice." Dominic's world was crumbling before his eyes. His adoptive mother was confessing that everything had been based on lies. The woman he believed he loved was declaring love for another man, and his grand plan for revenge was transforming into the liberation of his enemies. That was when he did the most desperate and dangerous thing he could do. He pulled out a gun. "If I can't have her," he said, pointing the pistol directly at Isabella, "then no one can." But Richard was already moving. Years of Andrew Morris's paranoia had included self-defense classes and training in risk situations. He pushed Isabella aside and launched himself at Dominic before the man could pull the trigger. The shot echoed through the mountains, scaring birds and making Helen scream. But when the smoke cleared and the two men stopped fighting on the ground, it was Dominic who was moaning in pain, the gun thrown too far away to reach. Richard slowly got up, checking that Isabella was okay before looking at the fallen man. "The fake documents," he said, panting. "Where are the copies?" Dominic laughed even through the pain, blood flowing from a cut on his lip. "You think I'm an amateur? They're in a safe, with instructions to be delivered to the police if anything happens to me." "No, they aren't." The voice came from behind them. It was Marcus, Richard's private investigator, accompanied by 2 federal agents. "We found your safe this morning, along with your document forgery lab in New York. You're under arrest." As Dominic was led away in handcuffs, shouting threats and curses, Richard finally allowed himself to embrace Isabella completely. She trembled in his arms, but not from fear, from relief. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "It's finally over." Chapter 8. 3 hours later, when the officers finally left taking Dominic and all the forged documentation, the country house in Lake Placid was enveloped in a silence that was no longer threatening, but healing. Helen had retired to what was once her room, saying she needed time to process everything that had happened. Richard's security guards maintained a discreet vigil at the property boundaries, but the real danger had passed. Richard and Isabella found themselves in the old living room, where a fireplace crackled softly and the windows showed. The sunset tinting the mountains gold and crimson. For the first time in days, perhaps in years, they were truly alone, without threats, without secrets, without the guilt that had separated them for so long. "I can't believe it's over," said he. Isabella, letting herself fall onto the old sofa where so many childhood memories had been created. "It seems surreal." Richard sat beside her, but maintaining a respectful distance, as if he were still processing the new reality where they could be together. "For years I dreamed of this moment, discovering the truth about my mother. But I never imagined it would come with this." He looked at her, his dark eyes shining with a new intensity. "With you." "Richard." Isabella turned to face him completely. "I need you to understand something. When I said I loved you in front of Dominic, it wasn't just to provoke him. I know." He gently interrupted, raising his hand to touch her face. "Because I love you too. Have loved you for years and hated myself for it." The tears that sprang to Isabella's eyes this time were of pure relief. How many nights did I spend awake feeling monstrous for wanting my brother? How many times did I force myself to date other men hoping these feelings would disappear? Many, I imagine. Just as I threw myself into work, into business, into anything that would keep me away from home during holidays when you were there. Richard slid his thumb across her face, drying a tear. "I remember every dress you wore, every smile you directed, at me every time you danced in the garden thinking no one was watching. You watched me? Always. And always hated myself afterward for it." He chuckled softly, a sound without humor, until it reached a point where I stopped trying to fight what I felt and just began to accept that it would be my curse, that I would always love a woman I could not have. Isabella moved closer until their knees touched. "And now?" "Now." Richard hesitated, as if he still couldn't believe in the freedom they had been given. "Now I don't know how to process that I can really have you, that I can touch you, kiss you, love you without it being wrong." It was Isabella who closed the final distance between them, leaning forward until their lips almost touched. "Then kiss me," she whispered. "Kiss me like you've always wanted to." The kiss was different from all they had shared before. There was no guilt, no rush, no fear of being discovered. It was slow, explorative, full of years of repressed desire finally being released. Richard pulled her closer, his hands entangling in her hair, while Isabella melted against him as if it was where she always should have been. When they separated, both were breathless, their hearts beating erratically. "I want you," said Isabella, her voice hoarse with desire. "I want you in all the ways I always imagined but never could have." Richard closed his eyes, fighting against the impulse to carry her to the bedroom immediately. "Are you sure? After everything you went through with Dominic, after all the violence, especially after all that?" Isabella held his face between her hands, forcing him to look into her eyes. "Dominic hurt me, used me, made me feel dirty and broken. But you always made me feel precious. Even when we thought it was forbidden, you always treated me as something sacred. Because that's what you are to me." Richard kissed the palm of her hand. "You're the only good thing left of my family, the only thing that makes everything worthwhile." They stood up together, hands intertwined, and climbed the stairs toward the room that once was Helen's. The moon had risen, bathing the house in a silver light that made everything ethereal, almost magical. At the threshold, Richard stopped. "If we do this, there's no going back," he said, his voice tense with anticipation and nervousness. "I will cease to be my sister forever and become mine." "I already am yours," replied Isabella, pulling him into the room. "I always have been. We were just waiting for the world to align so we could acknowledge it." The first time they made love was with an almost reverent tenderness, as if each touch was a promise, each kiss a prayer of gratitude for finally being able to be together. Richard explored every inch of Isabella's skin, as if it were sacred territory he had waited a lifetime to know. She responded with a passion that had been repressed for years, giving herself completely to the man she had always loved, but never been able to have. Afterward, lying intertwined among the old sheets, watching the moon through the window, Isabella traced lazy circles on Richard's chest. "What happens now?" "Now we live," he answered, kissing the top of her head. "We live the life we always should have had, without guilt, without secrets, without fear." "And your mother?" Richard considered the question for a long moment. "I don't know. Part of me wants to hate her forever for what she did, but another part understands that she was trying to survive in the way she knew how," he sighed. "Maybe it's time for all of us to learn to forgive." Isabella snuggled closer to him, feeling the constant beat of the heart she now knew was hers forever. "I love you, Richard Morris, not as a sister, not as family. I love you as a woman loves a man, with every fiber of my being." "And I love you back, Isabella Parker," he said, using her true name for the first time. "I love you as I always should have loved, completely, without reservations, without fear. Outside, Helen watched from the window of the room next door, seeing the soft light coming from the room where her son had finally found happiness. Perhaps, she thought, some happy endings were worth all the mistakes made along the way. Perhaps true love always found a way to win, no matter how many obstacles were placed in its path. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was never too late to start over. Chapter 9. 6 months later, the mansion on the Upper East Side had transformed into something completely different. The heavy curtains that Andrew Morris had preferred were replaced by light fabrics that allowed natural light to enter. The corridors that once echoed only with lonely footsteps now resonated with laughter, conversations, and music. Isabella had brought life to every corner of the house, just as she had brought life to Richard's heart. The news of their relationship had initially caused a scandal in New York high society. Some whispered about the siblings who married, ignoring the truth that Richard made sure to make public through a detailed interview with the main newspapers. Others simply envied the obvious love that radiated from the couple every time they appeared together. But Richard had learned from his father's mistakes. He no longer cared about society's opinion. The only opinion that mattered was Isabella's, and she had made very clear where she wanted to be. This Saturday morning, Richard woke up as he had woken up every day for the past few months, with Isabella nestled against his chest, her curly hair spread across the pillow like a golden halo. The sun entered through the windows of the master bedroom, the same room where his parents once slept in separate beds, maintaining a cold distance that now seemed impossible to imagine. "Good morning, love of my life," murmured Isabella against his neck, her lips brushing his warm skin in small morning kisses that always made Richard shiver. "Good morning, my soul," he responded, tightening his arms around her. They had developed their own terms of endearment, expressions of love that no one else would use or completely understand. "Did you sleep well?" "I always sleep well when I'm in your arms." Isabella raised her head to look at him, her honey eyes shining with the morning light. "But I dreamed about the ceremony again." Richard smiled. In 2 weeks, they would marry at the country house in Lake Placid, exactly at the location where they had discovered the truth about their family and where they had loved each other for the first time. It would be a small, intimate ceremony, just for the people who really mattered. "Nervous?" "Eager," she corrected, kissing the tip of his chin. "Eager to officially be your wife. For the whole world to know that you chose me and I chose you." They got up together, as they did every morning, and went down for breakfast prepared by the new cook Isabella had hired, a cheerful lady from upstate who filled the house with the smells of homemade bread and fresh pancakes. At the kitchen table, they found the morning gift that had become tradition, a perfect cup of coffee and a fresh rose that Richard always left beside Isabella's plate. "You need to stop spoiling me like this," she said, but picked up the rose and smelled it, with a smile that belied her words. "Never." Richard pulled her in for a quick kiss before sitting down. "I have 23 years of spoiling to make up for." The sound of the doorbell interrupted them. Richard frowned. They weren't expecting visitors so early. But when the butler announced Helen's arrival, they looked at each other with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Helen had returned to New York a few weeks after the events in Lake Placid, but maintained a respectful distance from the couple. She had settled in a small apartment in Chelsea and was in therapy to deal with the decades of decisions she had made. Her visits were rare and always scheduled. She never appeared without warning. She entered the kitchen wearing a light blue dress and carrying a white envelope. She looked younger than in the first times they saw her after the reunion, as if facing the truth had relieved a weight she had carried for decades. "Sorry for appearing without warning," she said hesitantly, "but I received something this morning that I thought you should see immediately." Richard automatically tensed. There was still a part of him that associated surprises involving Helen with problems. But Isabella stood up and offered a chair to the woman who was technically her mother-in-law, although the family ties between them were too complicated for simple labels. "What is it?" asked Isabella gently. Helen opened the envelope and took out a handwritten letter and an old photo. It's from Dominic, from prison. She paused, seeing the immediate tension on both their faces. Don't worry, it's not a threat, it's an apology. Richard took the letter reluctantly. Dominic's handwriting was careful, almost formal, very different from the uncontrolled man they had confronted in Lake Placid. The letter was long, but the first line said it all. I deeply regret the pain I caused all of you. I know my actions were unforgivable, but I need you to know that it was never about revenge. It was about trying to fill a void I thought only your love could heal. He continues, said Helen when Richard paused in his reading. He says that during the months in prison, he finally understood that love cannot be forced or manipulated. That you two love each other in a way he could never compete with, even if he were mentally sound. Isabella took the photo that Helen had brought. It was an image of Edward Parker with a small child, herself still a baby. Where did this come from? Dominic had kept it. It was the only photo left of his father with you. Helen gently touched the edge of the photo. He wants you to have it. Said you deserve to know the father you lost, even if through a single image. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the face of the man who was her biological father. Edward Parker had kind eyes and a warm smile, and was holding the baby with obvious tenderness. He seems kind. He was, confirmed Helen. Her own voice choked. Edward was the gentlest man I've ever known. He would have loved you, infinitely, if he had had the chance. Richard watched Isabella study the photo, seeing the emotion pass across her face. He knew she had grown up without references to her biological father, knowing only vague stories from Andrew Morris. Having this visual connection to her true origins was an unexpected gift. There's one more thing, said Helen, taking a deep breath. Dominic specifically asked me to say that he wishes for your happiness, that he hopes you find the peace he never managed to find. The silence that followed was thoughtful, not tense. Richard took Isabella's hand, intertwining their fingers. It's strange, he finally said, but somehow it gives me peace, knowing that he understood. Me too, agreed Isabella. I don't forgive what he did, but I understand the pain that led him to do it. Helen stood up to leave, but before reaching the door she turned. Did you know it's impossible to look at you two and not see the love, she said, a sad but genuine smile on her face. Even when we thought it was forbidden, it was obvious. To anyone who really looked, you were made for each other. After Helen left, Richard and Isabella remained silent in the kitchen, processing the unexpected visit and the revelations it had brought. Edward Parker's photo was on the table between them, a bridge to a past they never knew, but which had shaped their lives in ways they were just beginning to understand. You know what moves me most about marrying? Isabella suddenly said, breaking the silence. What? It's that we'll be creating our own family, our own story, without the past's mistakes, without the secrets, without the lies. She looked at him with eyes bright with determination and love. Just the two of us, building something new and true. Richard stood up and pulled her into an embrace that seemed to seal a promise. Forever, he murmured against her hair. The two of us, forever. Outside, New York lived its frantic life as always, but inside the mansion that once had been a mausoleum of silences, two people who loved each other against all odds were writing a new chapter, a chapter where true love had